Excellencies, dear participants, dear speakers and experts, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you to this webinar, Unveiling the New Principles on Effective Interviewing for Investigations and Information Gathering. The event is co-organized by the Association for the Prevention of Torture, APT, the Anti-Torture Initiative, and the Norwegian Center for Human Rights. And we are very pleased to see the great interest in this initiative showed by the high number of participants who are joining as we start. I'm Barbara Bennett. I'm the Secretary General of the APT, a Geneva-based international NGO that, together with the two co-organizers, supported the development of the principles over the last years. And it's a great honor to serve you as a Master of Ceremony during this event. Let me start with some organizational information. First, interpretation is available in French and in Spanish. And to access interpretation, you can click on the language on the bottom of your screen in the Zoom menu bar. The event is being recorded and the recording will be made publicly available afterwards. If you wish to share information on social media, you are encouraged to use the hashtag #MéndezPrinciples and #EffectiveInterviewing. And last but not least, to allow for an exchange, we really encourage you to ask questions or write comments in writing using the Q&A function on the Zoom menu bar. And you can ask questions or make comments in English, French, and Spanish. But we would be grateful if you could keep these short. The questions and comments will be made visible to all participants, and they will be answered either in writing or orally by the panelists. So let's move to the launching event itself and to the principles. The objective of this event is really to present the rationale and content of the principles on effective interviewing for investigation and information gathering and build support for it. The principles are currently available on our respective websites, APT, ATI, and Norwegian Center. They are available only in English for the time being, but we are working on translations into all UN languages. The principles are the result of a 3.5 years expert-driven process. And I would like to warmly thank here the two co-chairs, Juan Mendez and Mark Thompson, the former Secretary General of APT, for their great leadership. And I would also like to thank all the other members of the steering committee for their expertise, dedication, and time. And it's a pleasure to have several members with us today, either as speakers or as experts, and they will be able to answer your questions. I would also like to extend the thanks to the editor and to my colleagues at the APT and colleagues from ATI and Norwegian Center, as well as to the drafters, and last but not least, all the members of the Advisory Council for their useful comments and contributions. Let's move to the agenda of this event. The principles will be presented by Juan Mendez first and then discussed in two segments. The first segment will look at the foundations of practice, whereas the second segment focuses on implementation. The Mendez principles uniquely advance both outcomes and investigation and respect for human rights. And this is why we are very pleased to have opening remarks by both the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Director of Operations from the UNODC. So without further ado, it's a great pleasure to start this event with a video recorded opening remarks by Michelle Bachelet, the High Commissioner for Human Rights.
Excellencies, colleagues, I'm honored to join this global event launching the principles on effective interviewing for investigations and information gathering. I thank the Government of Norway, the Association for the Prevention of Torture, the Norwegian Center for Human Rights, and the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime for the long-standing partnerships with my office on a wide range of human rights issues, including in supporting the development of these principles. I also pay tribute to Juan Mendez, Mark Thompson, and members of the steering committee of experts for their dedication to countering torture and other forms of ill treatment. The principles being launched today provide concrete guidance for states to improve their law enforcement interviewing practices to ensure that they fully respect international human rights law and are more effective. They result from 4 years of consultations with over 100 investigators, academic, and human rights lawyers from all over the world. During his mandate as the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Juan Mendez observed that torture and coercion most frequently take place during the interrogation of suspects for obtaining confessions or declarations against others. Pressure from politicians, supervisors, judges, and prosecutors to solve high volumes of cases and law enforcement cultures that focus only on the number of convictions or crimes solved can create perverse incentive for coercive interviewing. Globally, these abusive practices led to flawed decision-making, wrongful convictions, and gross miscarriages of justice. The principles on effective interviewing advise how to shift mindsets and institutional cultures away from confession-driven practices and towards report-based interviewing. This method is more effective in obtaining accurate information and more respectful of the human rights of those being interviewed. These principles elicit reliable information that is more likely to be admissible in court cases because they do not rely on coercive methods such as torture and ill treatment, which lead to false confessions and unreliable information. There is another crucial element. Use of these principles can increase confidence in public institutions and help eliminate distrust and resentment that erode the social contract between the people and the government. For many communities, law enforcement is the primary interface between the state and its citizens. The principles can contribute to people perceiving state authorities, starting with law enforcement personnel, as agents that respect, protect, and promote human rights, not as an unjust or oppressive force. The principles being launched today are an important contribution to human rights in the administration of justice. I hope that policymakers will grasp their validity and potential. I encourage governments across the world to take the necessary steps to review and reform the interviewing and information gathering practices of law enforcement personnel, administrative authorities, or any other person acting in an official capacity. I look forward to continued collaboration with you as we strive to enhance law enforcement practices that strengthen respect for human rights, reinforce the rule of law, and contribute to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Thank you very much.
Thank you, dear participants. We now have the pleasure of listening to Miwa Kato, the Director at the Division for Operations within the UN Office for Drugs and Crime, who is with opening remarks through video recording as well.
Excellencies, dear experts, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank the organizers of this event, in particular the co-chairs of the Steering Committee of Experts and the Association of the Prevention of Torture for inviting UNODC to speak at this very important event. I would like to express UNODC's sincere congratulations to all who participated in the process of development of the principles on effective interviewing for investigations and information gathering, which are being launched today. Moving away from coercive interviewing practices is a very important step to ensure dignity and human rights of all individuals being interviewed. Retrieving reliable information that can stand in court also increases the effectiveness of investigations, leading to improved criminal justice outcomes. Earlier this year, at the 14th Congress on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice, UN member states adopted the Kyoto Declaration on advancing crime prevention, criminal justice, and the rule of law. In this declaration, Member states renewed their commitment to improving criminal investigation processes by encouraging the use and sharing of good practices on legally grounded, evidence-based interviewing methods. This will reduce the risk of unlawful, abusive, and coercive measures being used during criminal investigation processes and enable the obtaining of best evidence, thereby improving the legitimacy and quality of criminal investigations, prosecutions, and convictions, and the efficient use of resources. The document and the declaration further welcomes the collaboration between practitioners, experts, and other relevant stakeholders on the elaboration of a set of international guidelines for non-coercive interviewing methods and procedural safeguards. I am convinced that the principles will be welcomed and a useful tool to many policymakers and practitioners around the world, and UNODC is looking forward to continue its collaboration with member states, civil society organizations, and experts working on this area. UNODC, through its headquarters and the field offices, supports countries in the area of police reform, including by improving interviewing methods and increasing efficiency of investigations while preventing torture, ill treatment, and disproportionate use of force. A number of programs also focus on increasing efficiency of investigations of particular types of crime and protecting their vulnerable victims. We support member states by providing legislative advice, specific tools, and building capacity of investigators. UNODC will also soon be launching e-learning modules on investigative interviewing methods. We have also contributed to the forthcoming UN Police Manual on investigative interviewing. In closing, I would like to acknowledge that the principles launched today provide a very useful avenue for improving police investigations. The police is a core institution for preventing and combating crime and maintaining the rule of law. They are also often the first responders to crime. The way they respond and deal with offenders, victims, and witnesses may impact the entire experience of the criminal justice system and access to justice of those affected by crime. It is therefore important to promote a human rights-based approach in policing and other law enforcement as a key to reaching Goal 16 of the Sustainable Development Goals and to ensure that we truly leave no one behind. By continuous efforts to advance the evidence-based approach to policing, as these principles launched here today represent, we can reach these goals, and we look forward to working with you closer in the follow-up. Thank you very much.
We are very grateful to both the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Director of the Division for Operation at the UNODC for these high-level opening remarks. I think both stressed in their remarks not only the importance of the principles we are launching today, but also their practical value, both in improving investigation, prosecution, and conviction, but also in respecting human rights for all. I think also both Michelle Bachelet and Miwa Kato underlined the need for trust between citizens and law enforcement agency, but also the implementation of these principles and this trust for the implementation of the 2030 agenda, and especially Goal 16 on effective and accountable institution. Before giving the floor to Juan Mendez, I would just like to welcome participants who joined us later and remind them as well that there is interpretation into French and Spanish available on the bottom of the screen on your Zoom menu, and that we are welcoming and encouraging comments and questions using the Q&A, and these will be responded in writing or orally during the course of the event. Well, it's now time to hear more about the principles, and I have the pleasure of giving the floor to Juan Mendez, who is at the origin of this principles. He will present the rationale as well as the drafting process. Juan Mendez is a very prominent human rights advocate, so let me just stress here that he was a UN Special Rapporteur on torture and other cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment and punishment from 2010 to 2016, and that he is Professor of Human Rights Law in residence at the American University Washington College of Law, where he's also the faculty director of the Anti-Torture Initiative. Juan Mendez, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Barbara. And I'm very grateful to Your Excellencies and to all of you who are joining us today. I am especially grateful, of course, to High Commissioner Bachelet and Executive Director Wali for their opening remarks and for the robust support of these principles. I would also like to thank the organizers of this event, the Association for the Prevention of Torture, the Norwegian Center for Human Rights, and the Anti-Torture Initiative, the esteemed discussants and moderators for their interventions and perspectives that we will hear shortly, and the members of the initiative's steering committee, advisory council, and drafters who have been able to be with us today. I especially want to express my gratitude to my friend, Professor Nils Melzer, the current Special Rapporteur on Torture, not only for joining us in our advisory council, for joining us today, and also for his unwavering support of this idea from the very start. After more than 4 years of fruitful collaborative effort with the participation and contribution of over 100 renowned experts and practitioners, as co-chair of the steering committee for the development of the principles, I am pleased that we can unveil the principles on effective interviewing for investigations and information gathering today. As the High Commissioner Bachelet said, in my experience as Special Rapporteur on Torture, I observed that the first 24 to 48 hours after deprivation of liberty of individuals is the moment in which the torture is much more likely to happen, and also to be in its more brutal and tragic forms. That is why I think it is possible to observe that in many places around the world, abusive practices to obtain information during investigations frequently elicit false confessions and unreliable information, leading to wrongful convictions, to wasted resources, and miscarriages of justice. Such practices are ineffective and counterproductive and exact great cost to individuals, institutions, and societies at large. As we know, torture and ill-treatment do not work to solve crime or to counter terrorism and are absolutely prohibited under international law. The principles we are putting forward present an alternative to confession-based interrogation practices. They provide guidance to authorities on rapport-based, non-coercive interviewing, which scientific knowledge has established is the most effective method for gathering accurate and reliable information, with the application of relevant legal and procedural safeguards. The principles will assist authorities to improve the effectiveness, fairness, and outcomes of investigations and intelligence gathering processes, while protecting the inherent dignity and human rights of all persons being interviewed, while improving civic trust in the state institutions. These principles are the result of an appeal I made in 2016 in my last thematic report to the UN General Assembly as a Special Rapporteur on Torture. In that report, I called for the development of such standards. Following consultations with law enforcement practitioners, representatives of UN agencies, civil society organizations, criminologists, psychologists, and legal specialists, in 2017, a decision was reached to develop the principle through an expert-driven process. To coordinate the development of the principles and promote the realization, in 2018, the Anti-Torture Initiative, the Association for the Prevention of Torture, and the Norwegian Center for Human Rights formed an institutional partnership we assembled a group of renowned experts to comprise the working group of the initiative, representing geographical diversity, gender balance, diverse perspectives, and deep expertise in the substantive thematic areas that comprise the principles. This included a steering committee of 15 interdisciplinary experts tasked with overseeing the development of the principles, an advisory council of more than 80 experts who provided technical and substantive input on various drafts, and a drafting group that developed the principles text, and lately an editorial group to coordinate and finalize revisions. At present, our objective is to secure endorsement by the United Nations of this document through a variety of means, but for example, the adoption of UN resolutions by the General Assembly or the Human Rights Council or both, and as well as the possible publication of the principles as a UN document. We encourage efforts in those directions and pledge to work closely with all those who wish to join us in disseminating these principles and making them a part of the normative framework that the international community has set up to eradicate torture in our lifetime. Ultimate goal, of course, is for the 6 principles elaborated in this document to be incorporated into states' domestic laws, regulations, practices, and training. Ultimately, these principles will assist authorities around the world to improve the effectiveness and fairness of their investigations. By moving away from a culture of accusatory, coercive, and confession-driven practices, states can draw upon the principles' best practices to help ensure that the presumption of innocence is respected, that only guilty persons are convicted, and that wrongly accused persons are freed, and ultimately that justice is served for victims and for societies at large. Central to this will be the widespread implementation of the principles. As we move towards this end, the support of the international community to endorse and reference the guidance provided here will ensure that they will be effectively applied and will constitute a significant step towards the elimination of torture and ill treatment. We hope to count on your participation in this important effort. And again, I thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion and to your comments and questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Juan Mendez, for this inspiring statement. I think you underline the importance of these principles really as a practical alternative to moving away from coercive and confession-based interrogation practices to more report-based interviewing that enhance both respect for human rights and effectiveness and outcomes of investigation, but also serves justice for all and safer societies. You also called on states to incorporate the principles into their laws and practices, and you also called the international community to endorse these principles, and we really hope that this launching event today will help us toward this. Dear participants, we will now start the first segment of the event that will look at more details into the foundations of the Mendez Principles and basically looking at Principles 1, 2, and 3. This segment will be moderated by Therese Ritter, who is a very experienced human rights lawyer and a torture prevention expert. She was a member of the steering committee. She is Vice President of the European Committee for the Prevention of Torture since 2019, and she's also the legal director of Dignity, the Danish Institute Against Torture. And she was also involved not only as steering committee members, but as a drafter in the development of the principles. Therese, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Good afternoon to everyone. It's a great pleasure really to welcome you all to this first panel on the Mendez Principles. We're very privileged this afternoon to have 3 distinguished speakers with us who have unique insights into the field, namely Mark Fallon, internationally recognized security expert and also a member of our steering committee. His Excellency Christian Guillermo Fernandez, Deputy Foreign Minister for Multilateral Affairs of Costa Rica. His Excellency Ramses Joseph Cleland, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Ghana to the UN in Geneva and Vienna. Now, after 4 years of work, we are delighted to be able to launch the Mendez Principles that represent a paradigm shift, as has been mentioned already by the former Special Rapporteur. A shift in terms of moving from coercive and confession-oriented interrogation to investigative and human rights compliant interviewing. Before we set off to explore the foundations of the principles and discuss how these may best be used in practice, I would like just to give you a flavor of the first 3 principles. In Principle 1, on the foundations, we explain how effective interviewing is grounded in research, in international legal standards, and in ethics. And hereby they stand out as being both effective, lawful, and ethical. And in doing so, we draw on a large body of research, which has shown that torture and coercion do not elicit accurate, reliable information, as was mentioned. By contrast, the scientific research has proven that the most effective practice is the non-coercive, rapport-building method of interviewing. This is the scientific basis. The Mendez Principles are also solidly anchored in international human rights law and standards. And of course, as someone from the anti-torture movement, I have to outline the absolute prohibition of torture and other forms of ill treatment as the normative basis. Along with this, freedom from arbitrary arrest and detention, and the right to presumption of innocence, and also a number of other fundamental human rights. And these are all an integral part of interviewing. In principle number 2, on the practice, you will see that we underline that effective interviewing is a comprehensive process of gathering information while at the same time implementing legal safeguards. So in other words, one cannot speak of effective interviewing without at the same time ensuring safeguards against ill treatment, such as being able to contact a lawyer in police custody or notifying one's family. We also explain how and why legal safeguards against ill treatment are not limited to the interview itself. Actually, it extends from the very moment of arrest, and it is applied throughout the entire period of detention. And finally, principle number 3 on vulnerability. Because while anyone in detention is vulnerable, we also, through these principles, show that certain persons, when they are detained, when they are interviewed, they are in situations of heightened vulnerability. This may be because of their age, their sex, their gender identity, their disability, and in relation to these persons, the authorities should ensure enhanced protection. So these are the first 3 principles in a nutshell. And we will now hear from our 3 speakers who will assess the importance and the potentials of the Mendez Principles and also draw in lessons from the national context. So it gives me great pleasure to give the floor to our first speaker, Mr. Mark Fallon, who is an internationally recognized security expert and a member of the steering committee of the Mendez Principles. Mark was also the US government's chief investigator, bringing suspected terrorists to justice before military commissions. Mark is also a chair of the International Association of Chiefs of Police Impact Section and a visiting scholar at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, where he is the co-founder of Project Aletheia, which provides a platform to bridge the gap between the science and the practice of interrogation. And this is only a short version of Mark's CV. So it gives me great pleasure, Mark, to give the floor to you. Please.
Thank you, Therese. It's really an honor to be here with everyone today and the opportunity to speak on such a matter of international importance. While I spent my career as a national security professional within the US government, I need to point out that I speak to you today, not as a representative of that government, but as a citizen of that republic. who has firsthand knowledge of the tactical, operational, and strategic cost and consequence of inept practice and the denigration and the desecration of the dignity of the victims on both sides of the interview process. As a visiting scholar at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and the co-founder of Project Alethea, we have a platform to bridge that gap between the science and practice of interrogation in an effort to transform interrogation for a better, more just system, as the Mendez Principles will do. I'm also the past chair of the High Value Detainee Interrogation Group Research Committee, and I have worked with research scientists around the world on the research for and training in these strategic methods of assessing reliability and truth. I'm going to talk about the science-based methods and their potential impact on improving the practice of global policing and enhancing national security interests. The methods should be employed when truth matters, when lives matter. Therese explained the foundational anchors of our first three principles, so I'm going to talk about the practical applications of their implementation as policy and as the framework for the evolution to the next wave of progress to improve the practice of interview and interrogation. The effective interviewing process is based on the legitimate need for the state to conduct interviews to obtain accurate and reliable information to protect the public safety and their national security interest. The Mendez Principles enhance those capabilities. They promote the rule of law, they preserve human rights, as well as the dignity of those engaged in the process. The Mendez Principles are grounded in science, law, and ethics. Whether called an interview, an interrogation, or debriefing, the systematic questioning by the state is not an isolated event, but a complex and adaptive process, one that involves human behaviors, human beings, and human rights. Grounded in international law, the principles reinforce the presumption of innocence, emphasize the fundamental right against self-incrimination, the right to remain silent, and the right to a fair trial. The principles are a guide for policy development. They are also the framework for the design of future training curricula, manuals, and other educational or instructional materials. The principles promote a shift in mindset and institutional cultures, an evolution away from confession-driven tactics toward truth-seeking approaches. A shift in culture and orientation will restore and maintain the integrity and legitimacy of governmental institution, which in turn enhances the public's trust. The principles recognize the absolute prohibition against torture and reject coercive methods enacted to humiliate, arouse fear, threaten, or induce duress. Those tactics are more likely to result in fabricated information and false confessions. They undisputably impair memory and trigger resistance and distrust, both by individuals and by communities. The principles promote the highest ethical standards, including the importance of the respect for law on both sides of the table, the rights and dignity of the person questioned, and the rights and dignity of the questioner, as well as the integrity of the information process as a whole. The strategic approach to interrogation is the adoption of an ethos of non-coercive, humane, ethical, and lawful practice, a practice enabled by science. The principles advocate for approaches that are built on rapport and a non-judgmental mindset. They hold that empathy, active listening, and the strategic use of information to elicit uncontaminated information are the most effective routes to the truth. The principles address the acute nature of the inherent power imbalance of those in situations of vulnerability and the heightened state of stress of those involved. The rapport-based ethos of the principles carefully consider the innocent and the vulnerable. I've seen firsthand what can happen when principles are abandoned and decisions are based on fear, ignorance, and arrogance. I know the catastrophic consequence that came from pseudoscience and amateurs who, under the cover of darkness, abandoned the hard-fought moral high ground when they embraced brutality in the name of public safety, and gulags were established to cover those crimes. When post 9/11 policy decisions embraced cruelty and torture as a practice, and that virus spread like a contagion within black sites, Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, and beyond, practices that lack virtue. I urge you to endorse the Mendez principles in order to improve the practice of global policing and accomplish meaningful systemic criminal justice reforms. The principles are the vaccine to the pandemic of family of interrogational abuses that have resulted in so much human suffering over the years. The principles establish the conditions that impact outcomes, where the ultimate outcome is truth. Rapport and careful strategy are the serum to uncover that which is hidden. I'll close with a quote from the foreword I wrote for a book about rapport for one of our advisory council members. Rapport is a mindset, an atmosphere, a trusting relationship, an authenticity, an ethos of mindfulness. Rapport is the Sherpa to the climber, a trek on an exploratory journey, a guide on a climb towards the summit, providing trekking skills based on real-world experiences, sometimes under harsh conditions, not created by the Sherpa, but those the Sherpa navigates through. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today.
Thank you so much, Mark, for this excellent presentation, both of having witnessed coercive interrogation and the harms, and also of the first-hand experience that you've had with effective interviewing, and not least ending on this very poetic quote. Just highlighting, I think what really is an important takeaway from the many points made by Mark is that effective interviewing essentially requires a change of mindset, where the aim is to obtain accurate and reliable information and not to obtain confessions from someone who is presumed to be guilty in the eyes of those that interview. So thank you very much for these reflections, Mark. I would now like to pass on the floor to our next and most distinguished speaker, His Excellency Christian Guillermo Fernandez, who is the Deputy Foreign Minister for Multilateral Affairs of Costa Rica. Mr. Guillermo also has a broad experience in multilateral affairs from New York and Geneva, and he also served as the regional representative of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights for Latin America, amongst many other posts. Please, His Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Teresa. But the most important is I am the best and good friend of APT and all the people who are there. This is my best title. Muchas gracias, Teresa, y muchas gracias a la APT por esta.
Thank you, Teresa and APT, por todo eso.
Quiero, pues,
First of all,
la invitación
I would like to thank for this invitation
Washington College of Law y al Norwegian Center for Human Rights.
and the Norwegian Center of Human Rights
Webinar en el que he sido invitado. No solo
for being invited for this webinar.
Sino también por los ilustres,
And also because of all the distinguished invited that are invited here and all my colleagues.
En dos puntos esenciales que me parecen
I would like to talk about two essential points
ya han sido expresados por los colegas.
that were expressed by our colleagues.
Importante desde mi experiencia y
From my experience, it is really important to highlight,
y comprometido con los
also
derechos
since I'm committed to the human rights, we need to understand this impact. First of all, I would like to remind you,
ustedes que están sumergidos constantemente,
since you are always submerged, constantly submerged by this subject on the prevention of torture and the human rights, sometimes we forget very easily that this line, this timeline, and when I talk about this timeline, is that in 1986, it was approved, the Convention Against Torture. We are saying that we have 34 years and still we have a culture where torture
uno de los
is
mecanismos
seen as a
para
mechanism
interrogar y obtener información
to
y obtener
obtain information and
las
to
informaciones necesarias
obtaining
en
the
los casos
necessary
penales o en
information
cualquier otra
on the criminal cases everywhere.
situación. Traigo esto a mención
So this is what
porque
I
don
wanted
Juan
to say
Méndez,
because Don Juan Mendez,
académico, pero además un activista y alguien que no
he's
solo ha
he's an activist, and not
consagrado su
only an
vida a
activist,
la
but
lucha contra
he
la tortura
consecrated
por su
his
propia
life
experiencia
on
personal, y
the
eso
fight
dice
against
mucho. En
torture.
ese sentido, yo sí
And in
quiero,
that sense,
me
I
parece importante en este
think
momento
it's important right now
tener conciencia
to have
de lo que hemos avanzado en
to be
34
aware
años.
of
Y en esos
what we are
34 años,
facing
¿cómo
through
pudimos
these
pasar de la
34
convención
years,
para
and
que
how can
después,
we
hace
go
18
from that
años,
convention,
pudiéramos hacer ese
and after
segundo
18
cambio de
years we
paradigma?
would
El
have to
primero
create
fue
the
en el
second change
86,
of
creo yo, en el
paradigm.
momento
First,
en que
it
la
was on
comunidad
86,
internacional
where
decide
the
que
international community
la
decides
tortura
that
debe ser
torture
prohibida y debe ser
should be
eliminada.
prohibited and should be
Pero después,
extinguished.
a lo largo de
But
los
then,
años y en la
through all
implementación
those years and
nacional
the
de esa
implementation,
convención,
the
nos damos
national
cuenta
implementation of that
que el
convention,
gran
we
reto es la
realized
implementación a
that
nivel
the
nacional y que
implementation
la
needs to
mejor
be
manera de
national,
hacerlo
and the best way
es
to do
más
it
bien haciendo otro cambio de
is
paradigma
doing
y es
another paradigm
de
shift,
la
which
reacción
is
post facto a
to
la
have a
prevención.
reaction
Es
post
decir,
factum
actuemos
for the
antes
prevention.
de
We
que se
have
den
to act before
estas violaciones
all these
a los derechos
violations
fundamentales de
happen
las personas.
to the
Y
fundamental rights
ahí
of people.
exactamente
And
es
that's
donde creo que
exactly
los
where
principios Méndez
I believe the Mendez
a jugar.
principles
Porque esa es la
come to play,
tercera, como
because
si
this
fuera
is a
una tercera
third,
ola
like a third
de
wave.
desgraciada memoria ahora con el COVID, pero es como
Of course, we have
un tercer
COVID now,
cambio de
but this is a
paradigma
third
en que
paradigm
ya
shift
la opresión
where the oppression
no tiene que ser el
does
vehículo
not
para
have
obtener
to be the
información en
vehicle to
cualquier
obtain
caso o en
information in
particular en
any
las
case
entrevistas y interrogatorios.
during the
¿Cuáles son los
interviews.
efectos
So what
entonces
are the
de
effects
maravillosa transformación? Bueno,
this wonderful
sencillamente que
transformation?
esto nos
Well,
lleva a
mainly this is going to
tiene que
take
haber
us,
un fortalecimiento de
it
la
has to do with us,
institucionalidad
we are going to strengthen
democrática
the
para que esto se pueda llevar
institutionality,
a
the
cabo. Primera
democracy,
condición.
so this can be
Segunda condición es
implemented.
que
The second condition is
se tenga
that
que dar una normativa, como
we
son
need to have
las convenciones, pero ahora los principios que
we
sean
need to
claros
have
y que
regulations.
sean
We need to have
sumamente
clear principles.
transparentes.
These
¿Por qué?
principles are
Porque
very
ahí viene el
transparent.
tercer elemento
Why?
que todo
Because then
el
we are
mundo ha
going to have the
mencionado el día
third
de hoy,
element
y
that
es la
everyone is
dinámica de
talking about
confianza
today,
que
which
se
is the
tiene que dar
dynamics of trust
entre
that
el
has to
Estado
happen between
y
the
las
state
autoridades
and
y
the authorities,
en las autoridades del Estado, pero
las
además en
the
todo lo que tenga
authorities
que
from
ver
the
en
state, and
materia de
everything that
seguridad
has to do
o
of
y en
with
materia
national
de
security
principios para
and
los interrogatorios.
also for
Cambio
those
de paradigma
interviews.
para
So
mí,
this shift of paradigm, to me
como
personally, to
costarricense,
me,
me
this
parece muy
mindset change,
importante,
it
porque
is really
significa
important
que estamos
because it
avanzando
means
y
that
que no
we are
estamos
advancing
dejando de
and
lado
that we are
ninguna de
not
las aristas.
leaving aside
La prevención de la
anyone. The
tortura
prevention of torture
tiene que ir mano de la mano con
has to walk
unos
hand
principios
in
claros
hand with
para
those
los
clear
interrogatorios.
principles
Los
for
principios
those
Méndez tienen que ir de la mano
interviews and
definitivamente con la
increase.
prevención de
They have to
la
walk
tortura.
together
Y yo me
to prevent
recuerdo
torture.
algunas
And I
experiencias
remember a few
de colegas
experiences
en el momento que
of my colleagues
negociábamos el APT y
when we
algunos de los
were
expertos
dealing with the
del
APT
Comité de
and a few
Prevención
of the
Europeo,
experts
de la
from
tortura europeo, nos
the
comentaban
Committee
que
for
habían
International
cosas tan sencillas
Torture Prevention, and we
como
talked
cuando
about
llegaban a una comisaría pedían que
some things.
absolutamente todos los
When people
ganchos
got to
para
the police
colgar los
station, they
abrigos
wanted
fueran
to
quitados de las comisarías. ¿Por qué?
take
Porque era
off
una
the
cosa muy
phone
sencilla, se
hangers
agarraba al
because that
detenido y
was
se le
really
guindaba.
simple,
Pero
but
quiero decir,
people would
el poder
hang
de que
themselves there.
sencillamente
So
unos expertos
that
pudieran quitar
that those
eso que
experts
parecía
could
que
take that
era
away from there because
insignificante en esa
it seems
arquitectura de una
insignificant in
comisaría,
that architecture
daba un
of
impacto tremendo. Y eso es el punto con el que
the police
me
station. It would
gustaría
generate a huge impact on
concluir
people that
mis
were there. So
observaciones.
this is
Y
what I
es
wanted to say. I would like to conclude my
la
observations here.
eficiencia que los
And I would like to
principios
say that the
Méndez pueden
efficiency of the
tener
Mendez
en el
principle
ámbito
that they
judicial a
could
nivel global.
have globally
Eso es
are
lo que está
huge.
pidiendo
So
la
this
gente.
is what
Cada
we
vez
are asking for
empezamos
to everyone to
esta
endorse.
larga
When we
jornada
think
de
about this
promoción y
journey,
protección de
this
los
long
derechos humanos
journey
por los
of
años
protection of
40,
human rights through these
definitivamente
years,
el responsable
definitely the responsible
de la promoción y protección de los derechos humanos como primer
of the
actor era el
for the
Estado.
protection of
Cada
human
vez
rights
más
is the
estamos
state.
viendo
So,
que los
and we are
diferentes
seeing
componentes del Estado
more and
tienen su
more that the
responsabilidad.
different
Y en ese
components of
sentido,
the state
ese impacto
have their
que
own
pueda tener
accountability.
una mejor
And
administración
so
de la
we
justicia
need to
y
have a
respeto
better
a la
administration of
verdad
justice,
y
a respect to
a
the
las
truth,
personas para
and
librarlas
to
de la
people.
tortura. Es exactamente las
This is
legislaciones que
exactly
la gente,
the laws that people,
la persona que camina aquí en San José, Costa Rica, es lo que
the
quiere.
people that
Quiere
walk here in
cosas que
San
tengan
Jose, Costa
impacto en su
Rica, this is what they want.
Este
They
tipo
want to have an impact on their lives.
principios
This kind of
buscan
principle
exactamente eso. Y
is
son,
really,
por eso me atrevería a decir,
they
de
really
una nueva generación.
are
Así como
from a
en
new
el
generation. They are here
2002,
for a new generation.
el protocolo facultativo de la Comisión de la Tortura
Just like the
fue
protocol
una
from
verdadera
2002 was
transformación de
a
paradigma.
real
Creo que
transformation, a
ahora
shift
también
of mindset. I think right now this is the same
Por
situation,
eso yo
and it has great
invito
potential.
y me
This is why I
comprometo además,
invite
personalmente,
everyone,
pero
and
además en
personally,
nombre de
I'm
mi gobierno,
committed
a darle un gran
in the name of
seguimiento y
my
sobre
government
todo
to real
buscar la
follow up with
implementación de
this
esos
idea and all
principios a
these
nivel
principles.
nacional.
We need to
Para mí,
implement these
ese es el
principles
reto que tenemos
nationally.
ahora
This
por
is
delante,
our
en el
challenge
cual
right now,
cuenten
and
con
this
Costa
is why
Rica y
I
conmigo
am
personalmente. Muchísimas
really
gracias,
counting
Teresa,
on
por esta
you, Costa
oportunidad
Rica. Thank
de
you
tener
so much
algunas
for this
reflexiones, nada
opportunity
muy
to
elaborado,
have a
pero
few reflections
siempre el
on
espíritu
those
de
principles.
Ginebra
This
está
is
muy
the
cerca de mi
spirit
corazón.
of
Entonces, empezar un día
Ginebra
importante
to begin such a
como hoy,
special and important
estando en
day like
Ginebra, allá
today,
cerca del borde
being
del
in
lago Alemán,
Ginebra,
siempre
so close to the
es un gran
German
placer,
lake, is
un
always a
gran
great
gusto y
pleasure.
muchísimas gracias.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to you, His Excellency Guillermo Fernandez. I think we are all very grateful to hear that Costa Rica is endorsing these Mendez principles. I think I can also speak on behalf of the entire steering committee that as one of the fathers of the UN Convention Against Torture and the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture, we are very happy to see that in this third wave of changing mindset and then paradigm shifts that we have Costa Rica still as an ally. You've touched upon a number of issues. I will not repeat all of them, but I think the fact that you talk about these principles as being something which ranges from both research to practical application in the venue of the police station, changing profoundly the way in which states deal with their citizens and the way in which citizens and individuals are treated in police custody is really something which is crucial. So I'd like to thank you very much for this very rich address. Now, finally, it's my honor to give the floor to our third speaker, His Excellency Ramses Joseph Cleland, who is Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Ghana to the United Nations in Geneva and in Vienna. Mr. Cleveland has served in various capacities, amongst them as Minister and Acting Head of Mission in Lomé. And I should also say that Ghana is, of course, one of the core founding members of the Convention Against Torture initiative. So as such, also an ally. Please, the floor is yours. You need to unmute, Mr. Ambassador. We cannot hear anything at this point. I think if you unmute, please.
Just put on yours. Hello, can you hear me?
Absolutely, yes, thank you.
Fantastic. I'm sorry about that.
No worries.
Excellencies, distinguished speakers and participants, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the government of Ghana, a core state of the Convention Against Torture Initiative, I welcome the completion of the Mendez Principles on Effective Interviewing for Investigations and Information Gathering. And I would like to congratulate the Association for the Prevention of Torture, the Anti-Torture Initiative of the Washington College of Law, and Norwegian Center for Human Rights for their tireless and appreciated efforts in coordinating the development of these principles. The principles provide a normative base for the implementation of effective interviewing and information gathering, which are key elements in countering crime. I trust that their implementation in practice will lead to better outcomes for investigations and at the same time, a reduction in the risk of torture and other ill treatments. In fact, I strongly believe that the principles, by changing how public authorities conduct interviewing, will, as a result, improve the public's trust in the state and its institutions, thereby strengthen efforts to counter crime and make criminal justice more effective. I also believe that the fact that the principles have been elaborated by experts from a variety of fields, including law enforcement, human rights, psychology, and military intelligence, as well as from different geographical backgrounds, will make it more universally accessible and implementable to all. In the frame of its overarching goal, the universal ratification and implementation of the Convention Against Torture by 2024, CTI is spearheaded by the 6 core states of Denmark, Chile, Fiji, Indonesia, and Morocco, and my own country, Ghana, has made it one of our key strategic priorities to support states in their torture prevention efforts through the implementation of safeguards against torture and ill treatment in the first hours of police custody, including training on investigative interviewing techniques. By way of example, CTI's training tool on investigative interviewing for criminal cases is available in 11 languages and is being used in police trainings around the world. It is an essential manual for police and other law enforcement officers to conduct coercion-free questioning of suspects, witnesses, and victims. I thank the Norwegian Center for Human Rights for collaborating with us on this important manual. Furthermore, CTI has held many regional seminars where states have shared their experiences and challenges in implementing safeguards against torture and other ill treatment, including a professional online training workshop hosted by Ghana in April this year. CTI partnered with the Norwegian Center for Human Rights and the Committee for the Prevention of Torture in Africa to organize the workshop. It also gathered senior representatives of the police service and criminal justice system of 5 West African countries, alongside major international experts in policing, forensic psychology, and torture prevention. The workshop created a platform for those of us in West Africa to engage with senior police officials and justice policymakers on how we can move away from coercive interrogation methods and embrace interrogative interviewing. It illustrated the considerable interest in effective interviewing and the equally considerable capacity for change that resides within law enforcement agencies. I trust that in addition to the aforementioned efforts, the implementation of the Mendez Principles in practice will lead to better outcomes for investigations, improved trust in state institutions and the criminal justice sector, and most importantly, reduce the risk of coercion, abuse, torture, and ill treatment. CTI will use the Mendez Principles as a basis for further awareness raising and capacity building efforts in order to support independent, effective, and human rights-oriented police services. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, before concluding, allow me to express my profound gratitude to Professor Juan Mendez, former UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, a human rights champion, an expert member of the CTI group of friends, after whom the new principles are named. Your work, dedication, and efforts were not only at the core of the development process of those new principles, but have strengthened the prevention of torture around the world, including in my own country, Ghana, that you have visited and issued recommendations for in 2013 and 2015. I also thank Mark Thompson, Secretary General for APT, and all the members of the various committees that worked so tirelessly to bring them to completion. Lastly, it is good to remind ourselves that the UN Convention Against Torture requires states to systematically review interrogation methods and practices with a view to preventing acts of torture. The new principles, therefore, should assist state parties across the globe to move one step further towards the eradication of all acts of torture, prompting reviews of police questioning methods and supporting broader police reform efforts domestically. I thank you for your attention, and I wish you a fruitful and successful event.
Thank you so much, His Excellency, Mr. Cleland, for this address, this very important address, and even more so for endorsing on behalf of Ghana the Mendez Principles. As mentioned, you are an ally of the anti-torture movement, and we also very warmly welcome the ongoing commitment to effective interviewing and the crucial role that Ghana has played in also trying to mobilize the entire region of West Africa on this important paradigm shift. As you mentioned, these guidelines, these principles are universal, and that is a very important statement, because this means that they do not only apply in certain legal systems, they apply across the entire spectrum of legal systems. And they improve, as you say, public trust in public institutions. Finally, of course, and most importantly, reducing the risk of torture. So thank you so much for these very important comments and observations. And now it is my pleasure to open the floor for questions and for comments. We have received quite a number already, and if I may raise one question here, and I would like to ask Juan Mendez to comment on this: how to deal with jurisprudence that permits tricks to be used by police during questioning, or inferences of guilt can be drawn from silence. Please, Juan Mendez.
Thank you, Therese. I want to start by acknowledging that the question is posed by David Marshall, a good friend and a very early supporter of this effort. We, in the steering committee and in the whole initiative, recognize and with gratitude the support that David, in his capacity as a member of the Office of High Commissioner in New York, provided for the first steps that we incurred on as we developed these principles. The question is important because, as you may notice, the principles have been drawn and drafted hewing very closely to existing international law standards and not trying to overstep those standards at the risk of being challenged on what international law actually provides for. But in the sense that international law is a work always in progress, international human rights law, I mean, and it's an evolving document, the principles may help develop standards that are not presently recognized as binding, but that eventually could become. And one of them is this question of techniques of questioning that do not involve physical torture, but that may nonetheless create a coercive atmosphere. And I think trickery is the opposite of rapport. As Mark Fallon explained what rapport means, you can agree with me that trickery has nothing to do with rapport. Trickery actually confuses and misleads the person into making statements that may be against interest, or worse, may really put them in trouble with the law. I think the most important thing to bear in mind is that international human rights law definitely includes fair trial standards and due process standards that dictate that that no one is obliged to make declarations against oneself. And although police have a right and an obligation to ask questions, the manner in which the questions are asked makes all the difference. Mm-hmm. And to the extent that trickery and other forms of oppression, creating an atmosphere of oppression, make those statements less than voluntary, they're absolutely prohibited by international law standards about due process and fair trial. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juan, for this very clear and concise response. I'm afraid that this ends the first panel. Time is really flying, but I would like to thank our three distinguished speakers very much for your unique insights and reflections on the Mendez Principles. I believe that I can say on behalf of the steering committee that we're extremely grateful to you, and we wish you all the best of luck in taking these principles forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Therese, for this excellent moderation, and thank you to the speakers for the great presentation. As you said, time is flying. We have now half an hour for the second segment, and let's move directly to segment 2, looking at the implementation of the principles. And I'm very pleased to introduce our moderator for this segment, Veronica Inestrosa, an independent consultant and advisor on international law with 18 years of experience. And between 2016 and 2019, she was a senior program lawyer with the International Bars Association Human Rights Institute, managing projects in Timor-Leste and Latin America. She was also an active member of the steering committee and actively involved in the drafting group. Veronica, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bárbara. Good afternoon to everyone joining us today, y un saludo muy especial a quienes se conectan desde América Latina. Bom dia. It is my pleasure to moderate this second panel and to welcome the three outstanding professionals that will discuss with me today the implementation phase of effective interviewing. Ruth Sekinde, Director of Monitoring and Inspections at the Uganda Human Rights Commission and a fellow colleague at the steering committee of this initiative. Her Excellency Mona Juul, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Norway to the United Nations in New York. And Professor Niels Meltzer, United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. Welcome. Today is a very happy day for all of us involved in the development of the Mendez Principles, not only because we have been given the opportunity to share them with you, but also because this occasion allows us to thank all those who provided support and feedback from different sectors, including international bodies, domestic law enforcement agencies, state institutions, and civil society organizations from around the world. The possibility of approaching the development of this work, both from a bottom-up and a top-down perspective, help us understand the gaps and the opportunities that we needed to address to create a truly useful document. One of the concerns common to all actors and consistent with our own expertise was the difficulty often encountered in translating international standards into sustainable and tangible changes at the domestic level. We address this concern through principles 4, 5, and 6. And briefly, I'll share with you what they entail. In principle 4, which relates to training, we highlighted the need to give the interview the relevance it deserves as a professional undertaking that leads to, that materializes, or hinders the effective enjoyment of several human rights. And that due to its centrality for effective investigations requires the continuous practical development of technical knowledge and skills, as well as supervision and evaluation. Principle 5 focuses on accountability, addressing it from different angles while underscoring its importance as a driver of change within institutions and as a catalyst for public trust. Furthermore, Principle 5 grants visibility to the important role that external oversight bodies, national preventive mechanisms, and civil society more broadly play in providing recommendations for positive and informed transformation in the field of interviewing. Finally, Principle 6 touches directly on implementation and the importance of sustained long-term state commitment to effective interviewing, and provides tailor-made recommendations to key governmental stakeholders based on their role in upholding the administration of justice. To help us navigate these matters further, let me invite Ruth Sekindi to take the floor. Ruth, you are not only part of the steering committee, but also took an active role in the drafting of the principles. From your experience, could you please elaborate on what value they add for implementation prospects, for strengthening law enforcement and the criminal justice system? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Veronica. Distinguished Your Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you to today's launch. And I think that we have a very interesting principles that we have with us here. And I'll take you through just a bit of detail when it comes to the training, accountability, and implementation that is provided in the principles. And I found the principles very useful, very practical, and very different from what we usually have at the international scene. Now, it is a reality and a fact that at the international level, and many times, people or investigators have failed to find ways of investigating because they lack information. And because of that, torture and ill treatment has often been used as a form of extracting confessions and as a form of investigations. So there was a gap, or there has been a gap, on how to extract credible, accurate, and reliable information. And that is why these principles are very important, because they provide for training based on science, and training based on and grounded on international standards. So training being brought within the principles is very important, because not everyone can have it. So once we train our law enforcement as is provided under the principles, I think it will go a long way into eradicating torture and ill treatment. One of the things that I found very important, or very interesting, was the elements that are provided for in the training, where law enforcement, persons in intelligence, persons in the military, including the judges, prosecutors, interpreters, and all persons within the criminal justice system who work on interviewing, the need for their training, and the fact that they're going to be trained in science-based elements. I found it very interesting. And let me tell you some of the things that within the elements. They'll be trained on how to keep an open mind to avoid prejudice during interviewing. They'll be trained on how to conduct planning and preparing for interviews. They'll be trained on how to build rapport and maintain rapport during the interview. They'll be trained on how to comply with international human rights standards. There's also training in ensuring safeguards throughout the interview process. Now, those ones usually lack, and without those, there will be abuses. They also will be trained on how to employ scientifically supported questioning techniques. How do you question a suspect or a victim? That is very important. And also how to use active listening skills. In many parts of our country, the police officers are so tired, they're bored. So it's about coercing, you have to speak, or else, and really you're making a confession. And so when officers are trained through all these aspects, then we are guaranteed that we'll have accurate and reliable information without having falsified information. The other thing that I liked about the accountability the development of the principles is the aspect of accountability, where the principles bring in institutional accountability, legal accountability, institutional procedures for review, where institutions have to do regular and periodic review, as well as reviewing technologies, because technology changes. And I like the fact that there should be transparency at all levels. Because in military, in security, in intelligence, certain powers, the higher authorities are never touched. They're never questioned. But the principles are bringing something new, or something we already knew but did not implement, where they're emphasizing the fact that all persons at whatever rank have to be held accountable. I found that very interesting. And the other aspect is record keeping, and the fact that when interviewers are interviewing, there should be a record that is kept, and the fact that there should be preferably a recording. That way, in the event that there's an allegation of an abuse, then there's an accurate record of whatever happened during the interview. The other aspect is about external oversight for independent monitors, where national human rights institutions are brought on board, ombuds institutions are brought on board, national preventive mechanisms are brought on board, and they provide an oversight role. I also like the fact that the judiciary, the prosecutors are brought on board, and they are required under the principles to provide that oversight role, whereby in the event of an abuse, we expect that we'll have a redress. The principles also bring in issues of complaints management, and when to report, how to report, and the need for reporting. And I find it very important, because we can't talk about redress without effective complaints mechanisms. I like the fact that the principles also dwelt into the implementation, because many times we have instruments that don't talk about implementation. The principles went into the detail of the implementation, where they bring in the fact that states have to have domestic legislation and should have policies in place, laws that should be, and policies that should be replicated into the institutional framework, whether they are regulations or code of conduct. I loved that, because then we're guaranteed that the principles will trickle down to institutional levels and be implemented. And the fact that states, during the dissemination of the principles, they're required to monitor and assess the implementation of the principles, and if possible, report. They'll be required, not possible, they'll be required to report on the development of the relevant regional international bodies. So I call upon the adoption of the Mendez principles. They are interesting principles, they are good principles, they are practical, and there's something that we can use in our countries. There's something that we can use as investigators, as law enforcers, because they give practical guidance that we can all use. I thank you, Veronica.
No, thank you, Ruth, for a fantastic, very comprehensive summary of all the details that the principles include, and also thank you for sharing the passion that we all put into making of this a very engaging document, for highlighting that it's not only directed at those conducting formal investigations, but that really what we brought together is useful for anyone that is gathering information. Ruth, let me just also add that it has been such a wonderful pleasure to work with you. I would now like to invite you to listen to a recorded message by Her Excellency Mona Juul from Norway, a country that has provided us with sustained support from the very early stages of this process.
Excellencies, colleagues, it is a pleasure for me to be part of this meeting. Norway is a long-standing supporter of the work resulting in today's launch, and I congratulate everyone who has been working so hard on this important milestone and achievement. I will focus briefly on 2 points on how upholding human rights goes hand in hand with ensuring peace and security, and why this work is so important. First, evidence frequently shows that torture and coercive investigative methods leads to false confessions, resulting in false information and failing to provide accountability. We therefore know that police investigation and information gathering that takes place in a non-coercive, human rights compliant manner are not only the right thing to do, but are also far more successful in delivering accountability. Second, we know that when security sector upholds human rights, it is an important element in working to prevent conflict and radicalization to violent extremism. And by failing to do so, security sectors risk doing more harm than good. With this as a backdrop, Norway sees non-coercive interviewing as one of the most concrete, affordable and practical approaches we can take to improving the conduct of law enforcement and security services. The principles of investigations and information gathering being launched here today provide positive and practical guidance on how to both improve accountability and help to preserve the integrity of security sectors. It is therefore very encouraging to see that such interviewing practices are adopted by more and more jurisdictions around the world. Norway is a proud supporter of the implementation of such effective interviewing within the UN system, and cooperation is taking place with the UN Police, UNODC, and UN Office on Counterterrorism on manuals, e-learning courses, and projects. All of these efforts contribute to achieving the targets of SDG 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. Let me conclude by underlining again the heart of this issue, that better policing and criminal investigative methods leads to better information and in turn to more informed decisions and upholding human rights. And we couldn't agree more on the importance of this. Thank you.
Fantastic. I know I speak for all my colleagues and the organizations involved in this process when I express my gratitude to Her Excellency for these encouraging words and for Norway's continued support. Well, now, as we all know, the principles are the result of a call by the mandate of the former UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Professor Juan Mendez. And we are fortunate to have in this panel the current Special Rapporteur, Professor Niels Melzer. Professor, thank you for being with us today and for all your support to this process. How do you anticipate this work making a positive contribution to your mandate and to the current challenges that you face? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Obviously, it is a privilege for me to be part of this happy day. And I really would like to congratulate Juan Mendez, who I consider obviously my predecessor, in whose big shoes I'm trying to step. And still, it is a moving target. It keeps growing, his legacy, which is obviously something we all celebrate, and also is something that keeps motivating me in my mandate to follow his example. I have been following this process from the very beginning, and it has been in the very good hands of many skilled people. But I would just like to say, and it needs to be said, this is an example of what one man can achieve, what he can trigger if he is determined. And so I have used these words before. I think they're appropriate, even if they're very historically heavy. I do think for our area of work, for the fight against torture, we can say that this is one step for a man, but a giant leap for mankind. If these principles get implemented, the world will literally change. Why is it a giant leap? Because the torture has, for a large part, for centuries, if not millennia, has been happening in the investigative process and has been dominated by coercion, by violence, by enforced confessions and testimonies. And this has had lots of follow-on consequences that are very, very destructive. So these principles really are about the recognition in practice that justice must be based on fact and not on fiction, that it must be based on truth and not what we would like to be the truth. That when we torture, or obviously I say we as a human species, then we get to hear what we want to hear, but we do not get the facts. We do not get the truth. And one of the most terrifying examples of this is the Iraq War, which was triggered by information about weapons of mass destruction that were extracted from a person who just wanted the torture to end. And so he made up a story about weapons of mass destruction, which led to the destruction of an entire country. And the whole region is still destabilized now 20 years later. This is the poisonous fruit of torture. And this illustrates the importance of these principles. In science, we have long realized 2 centuries ago that truth matters, because if you force people to say that the earth is flat, it doesn't make the earth flat, it is still round. And it is not exaggerated to say that the Mendez principles actually bring us up to date with the 21st century, also in the investigative process. You have asked about what is the practical importance of this? Well, for the criminal justice system, it cannot be overstated, the importance. And I cannot go into all the details for issues of time, but clearly, the information gathered through coercive processes are the poisonous fruit that have poisoned the entire criminal justice system for millennia. The inherent inhumanity, obviously, of coercion, the miscarriage of justice that results from it, the error, the arbitrariness, and also the cascading effects of false confessions and false testimonies, which then implicate other people that are innocent and are again tortured. It leads to over-incarceration, and then people who have been falsely incarcerated actually lose their normal lives through that, and when they come out of prisons, they have no other choice but to become criminals. So it really is an extremely important process that we witness here. It's a turning point that if we can get effect to this, if we can get this adopted in practice, as I said, the world will literally change before our eyes. It is a prerequisite, these principles are a prerequisite for fair trial, for due process, for presumption of innocence, and the required threshold of evidence, beyond reasonable doubt that needs to be achieved. I'd like to mention the 2 rules of the Convention Against Torture, Article 15 and 11. Article 15, that is on the exclusionary rule that excludes any evidence from any proceeding, any evidence that may have been obtained through torture or ill treatment. And by now developing principles on non-coercive, effective interviewing, we also know that everything else falls into that category. So information that has been gathered in other ways than in these effective, following these principles, are likely to not be prosecutable. And not have any legal value in court. And we see some of the effects of this, obviously, in the Guantanamo trials and so on. And I would not like to get into the horror with which I have witnessed that a few days ago, a US court has actually said that he would accept information that has been obtained through torture. So this illustrates the urgency also of these principles. It's not just nice to talk about, it is of absolutely crucial practical relevance that we have these principles now, that when I now will intervene with the US government regarding that statement and that decision, I have something to refer to. And I can actually back it up with these principles, which is of enormous value. And it also is something I can use in my mandate, and obviously many other stakeholders in their bilateral and multilateral contacts with states, reminding them of their obligation to review their interrogation systems and instructions, as is expressed in Article 11 of the Convention Against Torture. And this gives us the material, instead of just saying, well, you have an obligation to review these rules, and then we can say, and this is how, this is how you have to do it. So this is really an absolutely decisive moment and a very important document that I will certainly use in the remaining 1.5 years of my mandate, and I'm sure my successors will. And so this is the beginning of a long legacy. I think this is a day to celebrate, but obviously we should not eat the cake before we have it. And having the cake here really means that we have the support of the entire world community. And so this is an important beginning, but now all of us have to, together take it forward and get it adopted, that this actually becomes standard, the reality by which information gathering processes are conducted in reality. Thank you very much for having me here and for letting me be part of this great day. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for calling on that support that we certainly need moving forward. Your words are very encouraging, and I just want to, in the interest of time, just want to rescue that point that you made about the importance of truth, of finding the truth, not what we want to hear, not what we want truth to be, but what truth really is, and therefore reinforcing this message that we're trying to put forward with the principles on the importance of keeping always an open mind for all of those that conduct interviews. I have a number of questions, and of course we're running out of time. So I'm gonna read one for Ruth and one for you. I'm gonna do it now, and I will give first the floor to Ruth, if that's okay. So the first question is, what is the role of national preventive mechanisms? What is the role that they can play in promoting and monitoring the implementation of these principles? And that one is for you, Ruth, and Niels, for you, how to promote domestic implementation of legal and procedural safeguards. Ruth, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Veronica. The role of NPMs, National Preventive Mechanisms, is really huge. First, they have to be able to make regular and announced visits, not only to places of detention, but to all places where interviews could be conducted or any questioning is happening. So they also have a role of making recommendations and following up on these recommendations to ensure that issues of torture and other ill treatment are addressed. NPMs also have a role to train, if they can, institutions or mechanisms, other oversight mechanisms. And they also have a role to cooperate with other mechanisms or oversight bodies, so that there's a holistic cooperation and addressing particular challenges in every state. So they play a critical role in every state, but particularly making recommendations to state bodies and the states themselves and following up on the implementation of these recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Please.
Yeah, well, thank you. The question, I think, was how to promote procedural safeguards on the national level. Clearly, this is a very open question, and it depends very much who is asking and what is the function of the person doing it. Is it a question to a special rapporteur of the United Nations, or is it or a different monitoring mechanism? Is it the national preventive mechanism, or a national ombudsperson would have different means and strategies and paths than a civil society organization would have, or that individual human rights defenders would have, or journalists would have. So I'd like to say this is really, it depends very much on which role you have, and also in which context you are. So it's a contextualized issue. But clearly, safeguards, the procedural safeguards are the very basis of what we're talking about here, that also allow for a basis then for these principles here to be implemented. I believe that, if you don't have access to a lawyer, if you don't have access to a doctor, in these types of contexts, obviously we are also very likely to encounter interviewing methods that don't fulfill those standards here. So what I think is important here, that we have these principles, that we start connecting them with what we already have, the principles on effective safeguards during the first hours of custody, and how this links up with the existing treaty law, and to try to create synergies and bring all of the institutions that have mandates that are linked to what we're talking about here, the fight against torture, that we bring them up to speed on these principles, that we get them on board, and then we advocate and we promote, obviously, not only, although that's already a big thing, these Mendez principles, but also the existing frameworks that we already have been promoting for many years on procedural safeguards and so on. So I'm afraid that this is a very general response, but I think if it's not linked, your question is not linked to a specific context, I cannot be much more precise. I hope at least this is somewhat useful. Otherwise, I'm happy if we have the time to elaborate in more detail.
I think that was a perfect answer, because you certainly put forward the fact that the Mendez principles are there to reinforce procedural safeguards that already exist, and how by applying them we will hopefully achieve more respect for these international standards that already exist. So thank you very much. And now, well, I thank you both. It was fantastic to share this panel with you. And I give back the floor to Barbara for the closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Veronica, for the excellent moderation, and thank you for the three speakers for the great interventions, but also for the answers to the question, and thank you to the participants for raising these questions on the Q&A, and other questions have been answered in writing. I think we are coming to an end of this launching event, and I will not be able to wrap up the discussions and the interventions, which were very rich. I think there was an agreement that there is really, it's a right moment, and there is a need to move away from coercive interrogation, and really the principles come with an alternative that is not only more respectful for the rights, but also more effective. So I think we heard a lot of very important keywords in this regard, on the effectiveness, but also the importance of accountability, the importance of trust relation between the authorities and the citizens, and more importantly, this shift in mindset that is at the core of these principles. So having the principles and launching them today is a great achievement, and we are all very proud. But I think that's just the beginning of our journey. And I think what is needed is that translating them into practice, so these 6 principles are integrated into domestic law and practices and in the training curricula. And I think for this, as these discussions, the comments, questions and interventions show, this will have to work together. And the process of drafting itself was already a collective effort, but now we really have to join forces, first to make these principles known, and then to really work together on their implementation, both implementing these report-based interviewing techniques, but also work together on the implementation of safeguards, as was just discussed. So I think working together really means joining forces between state authorities, but also together with the OHCHR and UNODC, UN bodies, regional bodies, and at the national level, professional associations, national preventive mechanisms, national human rights institutions, and of course, the role of civil society organization is also key. So on our side, we will first work on the translations of and the dissemination of the principles, and then we will also coordinate efforts towards building a group of supporters towards endorsement, and also support all these efforts for national implementation. I think that really together we can contribute in making torture and forced confessions a thing of the past, really with the aim of having more reliable information, more effective investigations, and better justice, justice better served. So I think that to come back to a word that was used, I think by several, I think only by joining forces we can eradicate this pandemic and eradicate torture. So just in closing this event, I would like to give a final round of thank you first to Michelle Bachelet and Miwa Kato, as well as Juan Mendez, all the panelists and the moderators for their inspiring contributions, Also thank the interpreters who made this discussion available for non-English speakers. And last but not least, I would like to thank you, the participants, in your interest in these principles. These principles are not yours, and I think we should make them really change maker. I would like to thank you all and say goodbye. Have a nice day, a nice afternoon, a nice evening. Goodbye.